Welcome to the Humans Against Poor Scholarship Summer Grant Interviews. Each one of our interviewees is competing for a $2,000 grant to help fund their summer research. Do you want to have a say in who gets funded? Become a HAPS donor today by visiting www.hapsfund.com/donate. Hello everybody and welcome back to Digital Hammurabi. I am your host Megan Lewis and we are conducting the last of our 4 archaeology interviews for the HAPS grant. If you do not know what HAPS is, then at some point during the stream, please do go to the website, which is hapsfund.com. If you do know what HAPS is and you would like to donate, then we take donations at hapsfund.com/donate, and all donations go to helping students fund summer research that otherwise they would have challenges funding. So without further ado, let's get started on our first applicant. Hello, Francesco, how are you?
Hello, I think good. Good afternoon to everybody who's listening.
It is lovely to have you. Could you, before we get started properly, just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you got into the field?
Well, mainly I started when I was after the high school in Rome, and I studied there. I completed there my bachelor and master, and then I moved to Berlin for my Ph.D. And mainly I'm completing it in these months.
Oh, that's wonderful news. Congratulations.
Thanks.
What are your very specific research interests then?
Well, mainly I specialize in the archaeology of Mesopotamia, and in particular in the early phases of urbanization. So we are speaking about the millennium that goes from the middle of the 4th around the middle of the 3rd millennium. So when for the first time Mesopotamia saw the spring up of first proto-state elements and first cities in a modern sense, let's say.
Fantastic, thank you. When you're carrying out your research, what kinds of evidence do you have to consider?
Well, mainly, unfortunately, for much of the areas except the part of the south of Mesopotamia, where the proper city-states are considered to be, there's a problem with textual evidence usually. So sometimes you have more to relate on material culture properly. And on material culture, you can have a variety of elements from spanning mainly from pottery, which give you good reasons and for a chronological chartering of the occupations at the site you're working on. And on the other side, more luxury materials, let's call it like this. So raw materials coming from more distant areas or peripheral areas from Mesopotamia, which from the point of view of natural resources, it's quite poor, let's say. So basically, basing that on material culture, usually you have the possibility to infer some kind of social structuring.
Fantastic, thank you. And what, bearing in mind that a lot of our viewers probably won't be familiar with this this material and with the areas you're working in, what sites specifically do you have to consider when you're looking at urbanization, and how do they kind of feed into understanding how urbanization happened and maybe what some of the catalysts were for it?
Well, let's say usually there's when we are speaking about Mesopotamia, the main area which is considered is the south. The south is usually considered the paradigm for all the rest of urbanization. Sometimes we speak about secondary urbanization for the northern areas of Mesopotamia, so modern day Iraq. But in the last, I would say, 20, 30 years at least, we are starting to find that also in the north, maybe urbanization can be earlier either, but surely it was structured along different ways, different from the one that we know from 100 years from the south of Iraq or modern day Iraq. So for that, specifically my research would infer that part of the proto-state settlements that you find specifically in the area of Diyala. Diyala is mainly one of the affluent of the Tigris River coming down from the Zagros Mountains of Iran and intersecting the river, the Tigris River around Baghdad, in the area of Baghdad. So we are talking about the region northeast of Baghdad. There, I would say that we don't have any kind of textual evidence, or it's very poor for the early phases, let's say. But we have, through the lens of material culture, the possibility to infer that There, maybe urbanization started on a kind of dimorphic base. This is my idea mainly, let's say, and this is what I'm trying to pursue in the research I'm doing. So how in peripheral areas of Mesopotamia that have contacts specifically in this case with Iran on the east, the ancient Elam, let's say, there it was kind of a connubius between what was a nomadic element of the society that was, and the other one, which was the settled one in the city, in the lower city that we find usually along the river, which was granting a better way of communication also for raw materials. And that area you have to consider is specifically the main area from which tin, which was one of the main metals searched in Mesopotamia at the time during the end of the 4th millennium, was arriving to the southern Babylonia. So it's quite an interesting area to study.
That is absolutely fascinating. When you're looking then at the social stratification and the ways in which different elements of society work together, how do the nomads and the pastoralists, the settled urban dwellers, how do they work? Are they complementary, or are they competitive, or a mix of the two?
Well, usually for at least 100 years in nomadic studies, there was always the view, which also in this case was kind of based on the textual evidence we have from the south, also from later periods, so from the 2nd millennium, which we have a big amount of literature too coming from Mesopotamia, many areas of Mesopotamia. But you usually have this dichotomy in which, well, the nomads are the barbars coming, they are not urban, they have no gods, and all this kind of rituality in the texture. But on the other side, it's possible to see that it's not like this, at least for the area I'm talking about. There you probably see how the interaction between part of the social element, which was stable in the city, and part of the nomadic element, which was, let's say, in symbiosis with the social elements of the city. It was granting, first of all, access to areas that were more difficult to access for the southern entities of Mesopotamia. And secondly, it's reflected also in the material culture and in the settlement distribution, how they are distributed around these areas. Still today, these are the few areas of modern-day Iraq and Iran where imagine nomadic pastoralists of today are free to cross the border to Iran, something that one of us could not normally do, for sure. And this is because they're kind of transromantic roads across the mountains to rise up during the summer times, mainly because it was too hot, that region. It's still today exactly the same, and it's a trend which is going on since 5,000 years at least, and you can document it. So specifically in this area, I think we should kind of abandon this view of the barbaric, nomadic, coming down from the mountains, destroying everything, setting everything on fire and stuff like that. We are dealing with something that granted the building of a proper state entity in the beginning of the millennium.
Wonderful, thank you. For your own research, are you looking specifically at one site, or are you looking more broadly at a selection of areas?
I look more, well, let's say that the focus of my research is mainly through the lens of pottery. In this case, it's a particular class of pottery, which is kind of a luxury one. It represents usually a small amount on the total you usually find on an excavation, and it's a painted one. It's also really beautiful to see, aesthetically to see. And through this lens of this material, I'm trying to infer how the region was composed of this dimorphic society I was talking about. But yeah, to answer your question, it's not a single site, but it's a pottery tradition which is distributed from the lower Diyala, so they are more near to Baghdad, till the western part of Iran, modern-day Ilan province of Iran.
Thank you. And does the distribution of this pottery vary greatly depending on the site you're looking at, or is it relatively consistent?
Well, it's relatively consistent, and it's also interesting to see how a part of the sites, mainly the one we consider from on the western Iranian side, there you have no stable occupation. There's no kind of city or village or hamlet. There you simply have these big monumental tombs on, strangely saying, but yeah, along the old transhumant routes of the nomads in this area. So it was a kind of marking of the territory, working on a identitary level in the end. This was the main reasoning. And it's also the fact that it's not single burials, but usually you have big monumental tombs. We are talking about something 15 to 20 meters per 3-4. So something huge, also as a kind of workforce needed to do it. Unfortunately, I cannot show anything, but yeah, it's impressive sometimes to see.
That sounds very impressive. So is the pottery specifically only found in a burial context, or do you find it in other areas of
No,
sites
it's
too?
very varied, the context, I'd say. But every time you find it, in my view, you can find a connection to something like religions, to some religious aspects. Then to say if it was some kind of ceremony, sacrifice, this is difficult to say, actually.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, for sure, there was a connection with some kind of religious belief, which was kind of something that was keeping society together, especially in these dimorphic kind of societies. It's very important. It works as a meaning for an order and a kind of structuring of the ancestors and memory of these societies. And the society is built on that.
That's very interesting. And with the shapes of the pottery,
Yeah.
are they more elaborate versions of what we may consider domestic pottery, or are they completely different?
No, the main shapes are completely common shapes that you find also in the common pottery, exactly in the same site. But it's interesting to see that, especially in the major towns where you find this pottery, there it's really standardized. So you mainly have one single shape which is associated with this kind of decoration for this pottery. The more you move up along this trade and transromantic routes, along up in the mountains, more the shapes start to be rounded and more varied, and there's more freedom of invention, I'd say, from this point of view, both in the decoration and in the shape employed.
Thank you very much. What for the summer? What are your specific research plans, and how would you imagine that HAPS funding would be able to help you achieve your goals?
Well, for sure, I will. It will help me to end this last months of writing my dissertation, which is to the end. And on the other side, it will help me to start this new project, because I had kind of contract to write a new volume in a series in the University of Rome, which is called Historical Atlas of the Near East. And specifically, it's structured like a proper atlas, a modern common atlas. So the region of Diyala, which is the region I study for my research, will be the topic of this volume, which is due to come out for the beginning of next year. So for sure, it will help me to concentrate, sit there, write, and collect the materials I need for the period, because it has to cover us a bigger span of time compared to what I'm studying for my research properly. So it will help also employ my knowledge about these later periods of the area of Diyala, and to publish this volume for the beginning of next year.
That's really fantastic. I'm always thrilled when I hear about people getting so close to graduation. It's a long and hard road to complete a PhD, so congratulations to you.
Thanks a lot.
That's exciting. We don't actually have any audience questions, so do you have anything that you'd like to add, or maybe a question that I didn't ask that I should have done that you'd like to elaborate on?
Well, let's say mainly that if I can underline a single aspect of the research, is to my knowledge, one of the first approaches to this kind of interaction in between aesthetics, which it's mainly a branch of philosophy, let's say, art theory, and anthropology, specifically the nomadist and pastoralist studies, let's say. On the other side, it's connected to chronological studies directly dealing with the materials, the pottery, and the stratigraphy of the main archaeological site. So I hope it will improve in some way.
And actually, that's given me another question. Does this pottery ware vary substantially over the time period you're looking at, or is it relatively consistent?
It's relatively consistent, but let's say it was identified at the beginning of last century for the first time. And unfortunately, much of the materials was stored for 100 years in the Iraqi museum, And as we know, during 2003 invasion, there was a big destruction in the museum. So much of this documentation has been lost forever, for sure. So this is a shame on a side, I'd say. But
well, thank you so much for coming and joining us. It's fascinating research, and again, congratulations on your impending completion. And we will be in touch. Thank you so much.
Okay. Have a nice evening and good continuation.
You too, Francesco. Goodbye. Well, I have to say, I do love pottery. It's fascinating. And I love what archaeology can tell us about pottery and its uses. So that was Francesco. That was very exciting. We are going to take a couple of minutes break while I get everything set up for our next guest. So don't go anywhere. There we go. Hello again, everybody.
Hi.
We are back. Thank you so much for joining me. Before we get started, could you just introduce yourself and tell us a bit about how you got into your field?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Diederik Halbertsma. I'm currently a first year's Ph.D. student at the University of Liverpool in the UK. And yeah, I was kind of spoon-fed the field. So my father's an archaeologist and his father was an archaeologist. So it's kind of in the family. But I chose to get out of my father's sort of way by choosing the ancient Near East as a field instead of Greek and Roman archaeology. Yeah.
Wonderful. That must have been a really interesting experience growing up to have a family of professional archaeologists behind you.
Yeah. A lot of field trips. Yeah.
I believe it. I believe it. One of my overriding memories of as a child was my mother taking me around the UK to visit castles, which I did not appreciate as much as a child as I think I probably would as an adult.
Yeah.
But yeah, lots of castles. So what are your personal research interests?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm investigating an early Iron Age site in Moab, so the biblical region of Moab in what's now the country of Jordan. Yeah. So
I was just going to say, what in particular about the site of Moab are you exploring?
So I'm investigating this particular period as it's kind of commonly known as a period of dark ages, as it finds itself between, on the one side, the late Bronze Age collapse, which I think your viewers might be well aware of what that was. But so in a brief period of time, the sort of cessation and disappearance of the sort of major players of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then at the other side, fast forward 200 years, you have these new kingdoms emerging, such as the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and on the other side of the river also Moab and Edom and Ammon. And the period that comes in between, well, kind of known as these dark ages, without literacy, without sort of major public building works, and sort of focus on a more local sort of agrarian lifestyle. And my sort of major question is, are these dark ages really that dark? And I think that's where the archaeological picture really comes in as something that's much more complicated than just being dark ages. So yeah, why this particular area? So let's say around 120 years after the late Bronze Age collapse, several new archaeological sites started to be formed around the Wadi Mujib area, which is south central Jordan and falls within sort of what's known from the Bible as being Moabite territory. But this is pre pre-Moabite kingdom formation. So we're still in these dark ages, let's say. Well, maybe I should go into what the Wadi Mujib is, because it's kind of important to okay. So the Wadi Mujib is this major geological feature in the landscape, kind of cuts through the Moabite plateau, as it's known, or the Karak Plateau. And it's a sort of very deep valley gorge that really divides the landscape into what's north of it and south of it. And hence it's also often been seen as a sort of natural border between what's to its north and to its south. And so around 1080 BC, there's a sudden appearance of heavily fortified sites on either side of this important water source. These are sort of heavily fortified sites with massive towers and city gates and big city walls, often built on these promontories overlooking the Wadi Mujib, overlooking the water sources. And around 100 or so years later, all of these sites are suddenly abandoned. Very abruptly, there's no signs of habitation anymore. So on the one hand, there's a sort of onset of very rapid building boom. These massive sites are being built, and 100 years later, maybe 2 generations of people live there, and they're suddenly completely abandoned. So my research questions mainly is how did this work? Like why were these sites built? How were they used, and how do they help us understand these dark ages? And in order to approach these research questions, I look at one of the only excavated sites in this region. It's called Khirbet al-Mudaina al-Aliya, or KMA for short, because it's quite a mouthful. So again, this is one of these very heavily fortified sites, massive city wall, massive tower, city gates, situated on a promontory, only accessible from one sort of small hillock leading into the site. But interestingly, upon excavation, it turned out to be a very regular Iron Age village. So just a small sort of village that focused on pastoralism, growing crops, and harvesting crabs in the local river. So again, why would you fortify such a regular Iron Age village? There's no signs for these heavy military presence or anything. So why fortify such a site? And so my main research interest for now is I want to go to that site, revisit it. It was excavated briefly in the 90s, but go back there to more closely investigate how these fortification works were built, how the site in general was used, and then eventually why it was abandoned. And kind of go into the question: were these dark ages really so dark as people make them out to be?
Mm-hmm. That's absolutely fascinating. I had no idea that there were these fortified areas. So, do we know much about how this particular settlement relates to the other fortifications that you discussed? Do we know if it was the same people doing the fortifying, or was this kind of a individual villagers taking it upon themselves to fortify as their neighbors did?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think that's immediately hitting the nail on its head, so to say. So the main question is what caused the people who built these villages, what caused them to feel the need to fortify them to this extent? And that kind of feeds into, was this part of one sort of unified building project where, well, you can imagine this is a period of maybe within 40 years, about 10 to 12 of these sites were abruptly built. Now that's a massive sort of organization of labor. So traditionally, scholars have argued that this was a string of border fortresses from sort of early Moabite kingdom, a sort of precursor kingdom before the eventual formation of the kingdom of Moab. But that's not at all that clear if you look well, let's say if we take the data from KMA as a sort of proxy, and the other sites were also regular Iron Age villages, can we really speak about sort of an organized border fortress situation? I'm not too convinced of that at the moment, but it needs further investigation, of course. So yeah, it's one of the things I'm playing with a little bit is what if these villages maybe saw each other as rivals, and that caused them to fortify themselves. That guy fortified himself, so I should too. That sort of thing. But that's of course purely hypothetical at the moment. Yeah.
So when you are able to visit, what kind of material evidence are you hoping to be able to use to answer your questions?
Yeah, also a good question. So excavations thus far have mainly focused on the remains of buildings within the fortified settlement. So mainly regular domestic housing units. Now, one of the things that I'd like to turn to is finishing several contexts that weren't finished back in the 90s, that held evidence, for example, for communal cooking. But a thing that really needs to be tackled is how were these fortifications built? You can imagine it takes quite a lot of hands and quite a lot of manpower to construct such massive. We're talking about maybe 3 to 4 hectare sites with massive walls around them. It takes a lot of manpower. So getting a further grip on the sort of building sequence, how were these constructed? Was it all made in one go, or maybe the moat was constructed before the tower was? Maybe its massive walls were constructed in episodes rather than in one go. So those are things that we'll try to tackle. Yeah.
Excellent. And something that you see occasionally in other fortified sites is that, and I'm not an archaeologist, so if this is a ridiculous question, please forgive me. But you see domestic structures built in, like up against and into the walls. Because these walls were added after, it sounds like after the settlement was constructed, do you see that kind of interplay, or does it look more as though the walls stood apart from the rest of the town?
Yeah, that's again an excellent question. Thus far, we only it might be very different on a case-to-case basis. So KMA might look very different from other sites, but they haven't really been investigated to this detail. So the evidence from KMA suggests that the wall either built first or at the same time as at least several of the domestic structures, as they're surrounded by what's called these casemate walls. So double walls with small rooms in between, and several of the domestic buildings actually adjoin within the casemates, suggesting, well, they're using as a rear wall, for example, part of the city wall. So suggesting some contemporaneity between construction with those. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you very much. If you, what are your summer plans, and how do you think that HAPS funding could help you achieve your goals this summer?
Yeah, so I already talked a little bit about our sort of targets for visiting the site and what we'd like to do there, and that's part of a brief field season that we're planning at the moment for the end of the summer. Should everything be allowed to continue. Now, the HAPS fund, so we'll target these specific excavation contexts, but in particular, we want to create a sort of very high resolution 3D model of the site through what's known as digital photogrammetry. So to go there, create a very high resolution 3D model, which will allow us to accurately draw the architecture on a 1-to-1 scale very accurately, but also preserve the site digitally for posterity. It's a seismically active region, so one, let's say, landslide in half the city could be in the Wadi, down by the river. So it's good to get that recorded while we can. And specifically, the HAPS funding would allow us to sort of expand the scale of the season a little bit. It would allow us, for example, to hire a local Jordanian drone specialist, allowing us to take a look from the sky instead of just from the ground. which will save us a lot of time generating the data we need for this 3D model. And all of that extra time we can then use to survey some of the other and perhaps previously even unexplored sites, to kind of get a better picture of this phenomenon of these sudden appearance of the sites and the sudden disappearance. Yeah.
Thank you. And I have two follow-up questions, and then if we have audience questions, we'll go to them. For people who aren't aware, can you go into a little bit of detail about what archaeological survey is?
Okay, so archaeological survey is where you basically you visit a site or a region you're interested in, and you walk around the site and you pick up what's on the surface and archaeological material that you find on the surface and try to determine, for example, when it was inhabited, what type of activities took place there. Because usually archaeological cities or any activity can sometimes also leave traces on the ground, even when it's buried. Now, interesting for these particular sites, anyone can go on Google Earth or Google Maps to this region and actually see them on the satellite images, because they're not buried in a lot of soil at all. So these massive walls and a lot of the buildings within these sites you can just see lying there on the surface, making it very very attractive to do this sort of survey activity, because you can just go to a room and see what's lying, well, not on its floor, but in the fills that are just above its floor, for example. Fantastic.
Thank you. And could you very briefly tell everyone what photogrammetry is?
Okay. So photogrammetry is a technique where you use digital photographs made, for example, with a DSLR camera, which not only hold picture, so the images, but also hold some aspect of depth from the location of the camera to the object or feature that you're photographing. And by this photogrammetry makes use of a software that finds overlap between images and places one atop the other where they overlap, and thus can recreate a complete 3D model with overlapping pictures, basically.
Thank you.
So when you it was very, very briefly. I'll stop there.
That is absolutely perfect. And we do have one audience question before we let you go. Would such a 3D model be made to be publicly available after it's created?
Yeah, that's one of our major goals. So not only would the 3D model help me and the team I'm of in closely investigating the site and thus help forward my research, but we'd also share it with the local Department of Antiquities in Jordan, so that they have this site preserved and on record. And we'd love to also make it publicly available for anyone to inspect and basically walk around in 3D and at their own leisure. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk to us, Diederik.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was wonderful.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And we will be in touch in a couple of weeks. So have a lovely afternoon.
Yeah, you too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Okay, we have another 3 minutes, I believe, before our next interview starts. So everybody hang tight. I will be right back. Hello again, everybody. We are back and we have our next interviewee. Hello, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Lovely to be here.
Could you just introduce yourself and tell us how you got into your field?
Yes. So I am Theo Kassebaum. I am a second-year Ph.D. student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I'm in the anthropology department, but within that, I do archaeology. And then within that, I do zooarchaeology, so the study of animal bones, animal remains. as to how I got into the field and how into archaeology, it's maybe a little more practical than most archaeologists in some way. I went into my undergrad completely undecided, very open just to any field of study. And then I took some classes that were focused on Greek myths that I enjoyed. I took a religious studies class that I enjoyed, and I happened to have a student who I knew who was an archaeologist, and realized, okay, if I can take this breadth of classes and it all fits under this like anthropology, archaeology theme, why not declare that as a major? And then as I approached graduation, realizing, well, you kind of need a specialty to progress through this field. I decided on animal bones because animals are everywhere. Like every site is going to need hopefully would use a zooarchaeologist to consider the like environment in which people were living. So I decided that on a specialty, and then got into the ancient Near East through taking classes, and just enjoyed the rhetoric around state systems and these large-scale management of agricultural livestock.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up on a family farm, and so a lot of people, I think, believe that is what led me to it. And it would be a lie to say that doesn't influence in some way. But I enjoy seeing these parallels and think I bring something from that lived experience of how herds and animals interact at this human system level. So that's how I ended up in this field and program and pursuing this.
That's really interesting, and I definitely think you're right that having an experience in a particular area, even if it isn't what leads you there, it can definitely help inform your understanding. There's a student in Germany that I know who is an Egyptology undergrad, but prior to going into Egyptology, she was a professional jewelry maker. So talking to her about how ancient jewelry was made and how all of that works is absolutely fascinating, because she has a very different understanding than most people who are just looking at these objects as archaeological artifacts. And I have to say, animal husbandry in Mesopotamia is like its own huge thing. So we always joke that when you're looking at a specific time period, most of what you're looking at is receipts for cows and well, not cows, but for sheep and goats and that kind of thing. So definitely a rich field for a zooarchaeologist. Sorry, I have to find my notes now because I got caught up talking. So what are your personal research interests within zooarchaeology?
Yeah, so again, these questions of livestock management, so focusing on the domesticated cow, sheep, goat, pigs as a specific like taxonomic interests, and then going on and considering how these animals interacted in like networks of humans and the environment, so through space and broader political systems. So what the approach I am hoping to take is to consider animals through practices of care and look at this is what the proposal I'm hoping to do this summer, and I'm hoping to build this into perhaps a potential dissertation project. So as a second year, I'm relatively early on in this, but I'm hoping to look at markers of like disease and health, so skeletal markers in the teeth and bones, as indicating repetitive engagements between humans with the animals. So really bringing in this intra-site, inter-context, local lens beyond just animals as consumption, animals as managed as required by the temple or the other political power. That these the management systems were going on with like heterogeneous herds across sex and across ages. And so using traditional zooarchaeological practices of aging and sexing with this lens on pathologies to see, are there differences in how humans were actually engaging with these animals themselves.
That's really interesting. And when you do this, what kind of evidence are you considering? Like,
So
is it just purely bones, or do you look at other aspects of archaeological and written evidence?
So I primarily look at the bones. A thing I am additionally, perhaps like a side project I am interested in is incorporating the text, and specifically, not so much for this project this summer, but in broader scope of my work, the receipts that you mentioned in Mesopotamia of, I feel like there is this quite distinct division between the philologists or the people who engage with the text, but then the zooarchaeologists and looking at the deposition and the end context of the remains. So I do think that bridging those together creates this fuller picture of like action and movement within these systems that on one hand goes beyond just like this static receipt and like economic focus, but on the other hand can put a lens on like the living animal rather than this is where the remains ended up. Like this is how they were consumed, or they were used as traction, but then they died. You know, I think that blending those two is useful. I have to say I'm not fluent or able to translate any of the text resources myself, so I'm still working on like building those connections to try to like adequately incorporate that. And
I'm going to ask this on the understanding that you're your second year. This is not like you're not way down the road in your research. But what kinds of things can we tell about the lives of these animals?
Yeah, so a big feature is with pathologies, there's linear enamel hypoplasias on dental remains. And so you also have these in humans as well. But you get these markers of lines or pits or other stoppages in the enamel deposition that can correlate to periods of stress or nutritional deficiencies or some sort of shock that like shocks the enamel along the way. And a lot of, not a lot, some work has been done in Anatolia and the Levant, looking at those in pigs primarily because you can do that in a non-destructive means, as markers of like the broader environment. So using pigs kind of as a stand-in for how this urban environment was perhaps existing. You also can do it on long enamel, long crowned, high crowned animals as well. So in sheep and goat, but there is some destruction involved. So that's it hasn't been as like accepted as a common practice. But as I'm going to try to argue that there's perhaps a reason to try to use it just to see again these context of the living animal and this context of how in these developmental stages, because there's stages of like when the M1 develops, the first molar, the second molar, and the third molar that can align with phases of early animal development, to get at these patterns of by really incorporating this at a broad scale, do patterns emerge? Because oftentimes pathologies are seen as like the abnormalities or as the unusual and the difference. But I think that they can offer this interesting way to look at whole populations and patterns at that scale.
Fascinating. Thank you very much. So looking ahead to the summer then, what are your research goals? Do you have any projects planned? And how do you think HAPS funding will help you achieve your goals?
So I currently have a project hopefully lined up and that we'll be able to go through. It is in Israel, so with the pandemic still going on, it can
It
be
makes it really
difficult to try
difficult,
to
yeah.
plan. But right now I'm proceeding like it will happen. Plans are to travel and work at a lab in Haifa on faunal remains from Tel Abel Beth Makkah in northern Israel. So it's a really, maybe it's perhaps somewhat unique site as far as, I would not identify as an Israeli or Levant archaeologist. I'm not an expert in that field yet, maybe. But I'll be looking at context from the Iron One period, in which there is these known cultic sites and structures that have deposits of animal bones within them, and then also the contemporaneous domestic context. So I'm hoping to use this, one, just to catalog and get some more experience of recording faunal remains, like as part of an archaeological project, rather than some more like theory-based evidence, but then also to kind of test this out and try this really intense looking at pathologies and recording pathologies to see if there's differences in the domestic context and the care and the exploitation practices there versus the cultic context, and how they were provisioned at the site. And so the HAPS funding will really just help the travel. Being an American archaeologist working internationally, that's always kind of the big cost. So the travel and then the housing, and being able to do that work.
Fantastic, thank you. And we do have a question from the audience. So Zebra sees in your background that you've worked on tablet photography projects. That doesn't sound easy. He says, am I right in thinking that photo skills can be handy for an archaeologist?
Yeah. And so the tablet photography was actually it was interesting because I was photographing things I could not read and was relatively unfamiliar with. But it taught me a lot about light composition, and because it was these early cuneiform tablets, about how to direct the light so that the shadows would be able to be read and invisible in a digital medium rather than having the physical tablet. So that will definitely translate to photographing pathologies and bones through grooves or growths, and then also these lines as well. Knowing how to direct light to manipulate shadows in a useful way is something that I've found to be useful.
It is, I can't really obviously talk about bones, but with cuneiform especially, one of the challenges you find as a student working from photographs is that you have one light source and one light source only. And if it's not the best taken photograph, like half of the sides are in shadow and you're like, I'm not sure what that one is. So I can definitely see that being a really useful exercise if you're looking at like the smaller details for bones and remains like that. We have precisely 1 minute left. Before I let you go, is there anything that you'd like to share, or maybe information that I didn't ask you about that you think is relevant?
I mean, I just would say that if anyone's interested in archaeology, I think there's lots of resources like this. Your channel is a great resource, but also that it doesn't need to be something that maybe you were always passionate about, and you can always dip your toe in and become more invested as you go along, which I think is what happened to me. So
I think that's an excellent message, and something that we do see regularly when we do these interviews is a lot of people who have kind of been invested for like their whole lives. So I think it is really important to point out that if you weren't like choosing to be an archaeologist at age 8, that's okay. You can still like decide later, much later in life, like in your 20s even, that actually this is something that you're genuinely interested in and you'd like to research more. So Theo, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Have a lovely afternoon. Okay, everybody, we have a couple of minutes until our final candidate appears. So be good, enjoy yourselves, and I'll be right back. Hello, everybody, and welcome back. We have our fourth and final archaeologist of the afternoon. Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining me.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Before we get started, could you just introduce yourself and maybe say a little bit about how you got into the field?
Sure, absolutely. I'm Nathan Lovejoy. I'm a PhD candidate at ISAW, the Institute for the Study of the Ancient World at NYU. I'm in my 5th year, so getting closer to completion, but at least a year and a half out, I'd say. I got into archaeology and history in general a little later, I guess, not until I was in the Army. So my third deployment to Afghanistan really settled in an interest in the Near East and in this region, and I started to apply to schools there. Started excavating as soon as I got to my undergraduate, and worked in Turkey for several years during that, and then continued that in my PhD for the last several years.
Fantastic. I have to say that is a trajectory I have never heard before. So congratulations on being a first in that.
Excellent.
What is your particular specialty, your area of research?
So in a broad sense, I work on the Near East and Eastern Mediterranean for the Bronze and Iron Ages. More specifically, my PhD, my dissertation right now is trying to construct a microhistory of the Northeast Mediterranean, looking at Cilicia, so southern Turkey and northwest Syria, that region. I'm trying to investigate this on a social, political, and cultic lens, so looking at developments across that period after the Bronze Age and basically until the Assyrian provincialization of that region. I'm looking at it through archaeology, through texts, through art history, trying to combine every component that I can to understand what was going on and see what the local variations were. And one way I'm doing that is looking at it in multiple scales. So looking site by site at exactly what was found, what contexts we have for materials, where we have texts internal to the region versus external, and then trying to see if we have variation at a local lens, at a micro region, so in say one valley or one kingdom when we can define one, or across the entire space. So trying to see where we can define identities at a social, political, or cultic lens, or simply developments, what's happening and what's changing, where's continuity and where is change. I guess I can add one other interest in my actual archaeological fieldwork will not have anything to do with my dissertation because conveniently we have not reached the period that I'm investigating for my dissertation. No. So I've spent 5 years looking at Hellenistic or late Iron Age material, but that's been fruitful in a completely separate project. So we have a public space there that's connected to a sanctuary in the Persian and Hellenistic periods, and maybe earlier. We have some remains that suggest ritual activity that we're working to publish as well. So there's kind of 2 separate projects bringing my interests across the whole first millennium BC and a little into the second.
That is absolutely wonderful. And for those who are maybe not entirely sure, what exactly do you mean by a microhistory?
So by a microhistory, I mean a targeted history of a small area, looking at it for specifically the material within the region, trying to construct a history from an use not jargon, from an internal perspective. So look at it from the local perspective, whether that's from site archaeology or from texts written by the people that live there rather than about them. So trying to write a history from that holistic approach and target it for a small kingdom or a geographical area, something like that, rather than an imperial view from outside.
Mm-hmm. And does that constrain your chronological scope as well?
It does. So it at least influences how I can approach, say, each century or so.
Mm-hmm.
The first chunk of this time, the 12th and 11th century, lacks textual evidence from most of the region, even wider than my core region, but also from within. So it's mainly constructed by archaeology. So I have to try to define identity that way, or define if there is a political institution, if we have any sort of profitability within the economy at the time, or anything like that. If there's a temple that exists and we can actually date it to that time, without textual assistance. As it progresses, we get a little bit more internal evidence as well as external. So we can start to define maybe more finely the what's happening there. When we actually know that there's a political institution with a name versus the assumption that there is based on palatial architecture and administrative technology, but without a name yet. We can infer perhaps that it's the same one if it's within a few generations, but when there's a century gap between archaeology and text, maybe it's something different, maybe a predecessor, something like that.
Well, this sounds like an absolutely fascinating research project with an awful lot of detail and several different individual disciplines that you're kind of pulling together here. When you're looking specifically at, say, the archaeology, what kinds of evidence are you looking at, and how, for the audience who have not done archaeological work before, how do you then interpret that to try and tell you something about how society worked?
Sure. So in the ideal case, I would look at everything. But the more important thing for me right now is something that is contextually secure to an extent. If I can associate material with a layer, a level in a building, if that building is a house, I can infer that that is domestic archaeology. I can say that this is household materials or related to common everyday use. If it's from palatial architecture or from a temple, then perhaps it's institutional archaeology in that sense. I can say that this is connected with cult activity or administrative activity, and sometimes there's overlap in the materials we'll find, but I find it difficult to interpret the archaeology of a house and say that that's representative of the site versus the archaeology of a temple or a palace and say that that's comparable to the domestic archaeology. So I'm trying to distinguish that way. Look at the ceramic assemblage, textile production tools, food production and consumption equipment, administrative tools like seals or sealings. Whatever I can find, I'll use. And in many cases, because of what's been published, this relies on architecture or on monumental representations, texts, things like that. So we have a lot of statuary or orthostats that have been the focus of a lot of archaeology, a lot of publication. So then I also have to focus on that where I don't have the other information.
Because that's what you have to work with.
Exactly. And it changes site by site, region by region. For instance, one of the, I guess, micro regions that I'm working on within has maybe 2 well-published sites, one unpublished survey, and then the rest is texts, monumental texts, stelae and statues that have been found out of context, but likely from one major area. So it's to interpret that against, I guess, the better published areas is difficult. It means that I have to have a lot of caveats in any definitive statements that I can make about it.
Thank you. And something that we often run into in Mesopotamia specifically, and something that regular viewers will have heard me lament before, is the challenge of not having find spots, especially for things that were excavated some time ago or maybe weren't actually excavated. Is this a problem for your region as well?
Absolutely. Especially anything that was excavated, say, more than 50, 60 years ago, there's a probability, at least, that there was less attention paid to what was excavated, where it was excavated, or if it wasn't attractive, maybe it was not kept. So when we look at materials from an earlier excavated site that says we have only this beautiful pottery, it's all painted, everything was rich and fine, we have no local wares, or it was barely a part of it. So any quantitative analysis is out of the door. You can't use it. So you can at least think of it in a qualitative sense, with understanding that there was likely material that was thrown away or not kept. And even when it was found, when you find the reinterpretations of phasing, which we do in archaeology all the time, you have to try to understand why the reinterpretation was done. If it was first assigned to this period, but a year or two later it was changed to a different period, this might have been because of a discovery that was found that said, oh, the stratigraphy was different than we thought. These rooms connect in a different way. But it could also be that somebody at one point wanted the evidence to fit a story. It's something that we battle against all the time. So it's keeping in mind the differences in technique and process that we use now versus 100 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. I am a little bit in awe, to be honest, because the amount of material you must have to have a command over is really quite substantial. And we've really only talked about the archaeological material, and that doesn't even bring in the art historical and the philological stuff. What is your plan for this summer, and how can HAPS help fund you?
The last year has basically been dedicated to reviewing materials, looking through all the publications from about the last 120, 150 years for some sites, some 10 years for other newer sites, but looking at a massive amount of material. This summer, I really, really need to write a chapter. I need to complete a chapter on I'm aiming towards this concept of political identity, looking at the difference in construction of factions within a polity, at coalitions between polities, and trying to see what I can negotiate there, what I can come up with for this ever-changing political structure and the political landscape of this area, and how it's different between regions, as I was saying, with the micro regions and the multiple scales. So that will be the primary goal, writing. I also would really love to publish the materials that we've excavated at Kinikuyuk Nide in Turkey, if anybody's interested. On this ritual context. It's a trash heap that has this peculiar data set of faunal remains. So it has a disproportionate amount of scapulae, and even more so a disproportionate amount of right to left scapulae. So it's about 90% right, 10% left. So there's a selection process, and it is within the vicinity of our later sanctuary, maybe adjacent, I could say, on the site. So the assumption or the inference is that there may be an earlier predecessor that we just haven't reached for the sanctuary, and this could be a connected context. So we want to be able to publish that because it's peculiar and interesting, would be useful for anyone else. The way I would use the HAPS fund would largely be to allow me to focus on writing, maybe so I don't have to teach, and could focus on what I need to do to complete these tasks, and get as much of the information that I've discovered and researched out there. We know that it's useful to do research and to excavate, but it's not super useful unless it's published. So that would be the main goal.
That is, I think, one of the most often level criticisms about archaeology is you come up with all this data and you go out and you do field work for 10 seasons, and then you have 10 years worth of information and you haven't published anything. So highly in favor of publishing any and all archaeological information.
Absolutely.
So we have a question from the audience. How do you document find spots today? Are you allowed to use detailed photographs, or do you still keep journals?
So all of it. So we keep every trench, and at least one person in a trench will keep a journal. You'll diagram first in your journal as you find something. You'll diagram it on your plan, where you've drawn out your boundaries for the trench, everything you've found, and you keep it in phase. So once you have a phase done, you start a new plan and then record every particular find that you have. Not every piece of ceramic, but anything significant. You'll mark it, you'll give it a number, and then you'll get its elevation and measure it out from the boundary of your trench. Ideally, this can be done with with more technological equipment, but at times you just have to get it marked, photographed, and then you can measure yourself. You have a fixed point. You can use a line level, measure the elevation, measure it out from the boundaries, and you have a location that can then be plotted on a map, and then you at least have that. Then you photograph, and you photograph through its discovery. For instance, if it's a massive statue, you're going to find the first recognition that it's something significant, you'll have a picture. You take the process all the way down through excavation. That way you can, if something changes or if you miss something, you can then look back at your photographs to say, oh, this was maybe a different connection than we realized. Or for this wall, we didn't notice a foundation cut where they had cut into the earth first and inserted the wall piece by piece. And we didn't notice that. It looked as if it was just on top. So we can then say, oh, from this photograph, we can see two different soil types, something like that. And we can reconstruct perhaps what was missed in the moment for different, lighting, something like that.
Wonderful. That's a great answer. Thank you very much. I don't have any more questions, and neither does the audience. Is there anything that you would like to add?
Well, I guess I'll provide one more interesting piece for the project so far. So one of my case studies that I'm working on is is the storm god of the vineyard. It's a storm god from, we'll say, the northern Levant and Turkey, best known from south central Turkey, that is a storm god connected with grapevines and grain. And the name kind of originates in the 8th century BC, but I've been tracking possible connections all the way back into the late Bronze Age, where we have Northwest Semitic, so the more Levantine influence, where we have a storm god, Baal, who has messengers that can be translated as grape or grain or vine and grain, something like that. And while it's not exactly the same, we then have connections a century or two later that have a storm god depicted with holding a king's hand, and the king is now holding grain and grape in each hand. 2 centuries later, we now have a storm god depicted with grape and grain in his hands, and it's across a pretty wide region. And we have different iterations of this. So we have a specific version, and the way he's depicted is very specific in South Central Anatolia. And we have what seems to be a completely different imagining of how he should be represented in Cilicia, so southern Turkey, and the northern Levant, so northwest Syria, where there's a community that's at least depicting this god in this way. But it is completely different from those around him. And it seems like there's this construction that's happening over time, and then a point where it just varies and goes off in different directions in different kingdoms or communities. So one other case study that is at least interesting.
That is very interesting. And having said we have no more audience questions, we have one. We have about 30 seconds left. Stella says, what makes this region you research interesting for you, or why did you choose this region specifically?
So one of the main regions is this, or one of the main reasons this region is interesting is that it's a nexus of people, of ideas, of everything. It's at the center of Anatolia, so Turkey, the east, when we're coming from Assyria or Babylon, if we're coming all the way up, and as well as from the south. So we have Phoenician language, we have Aramaic language, we have Luvian language. So we have those three even just used internally. Later on, Akkadian influence and all this, but there's a multilinguistic environment. There's a political landscape that is completely fragmented. It's not controlled by any one empire, at least during this period, and it is under-researched in a way. It's a hot topic, I guess, in the last 20 years that's kind of come back with new discoveries, but there's a lot of room for publication, a lot of room for research. So I wanted to investigate what I could and realized that we were lacking a complete history. We just had either the archaeology or the texts separately in a way that didn't really provide a picture of these people and these polities from within. And that was the main reason I chose the area.
An excellent reason. Thank you very much. It's been a delight to talk to you, Nathan. I'm going to let you go now, and I hope you have a lovely evening.
Thank you. You too.
Bye. Okay, well, fantastic interviews all around. I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed all of those. I always love hearing about people's research. If you are new to HAPS, then please do check out the website. It's hapsfund.com. That will give you all the information you know about who we are, what we do. If you feel like donating after reading all of that information, and I certainly hope you do, then please go to hapsfund.com/donate. And for those who are not terribly busy tomorrow, maybe a little busy, but not terribly busy, we will be live streaming a Zoom symposium called Reconstructing the Past, Conversations on the Interpretation of Ancient Western Asian Spaces and Structures. And there is a fantastic lineup of speakers. I think it's going to be really interesting, and that starts at 12 p.m. That is noon, Eastern Daylight Savings Time. I think that's what we're in at the moment. So come on and bring your questions, because I'm allowed to ask questions for you. And yes, have a lovely afternoon. Happy Sunday, everybody. And we will be back next week. Who do we have next week? Next week, we are doing Egyptology. So if you're interested in Egyptology, we will be back next Saturday morning and Saturday afternoon, and then Sunday morning. It will be a full schedule, but it will be a lot of fun. So thank you all for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I'll see you soon.